podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Welcome back to the Love Tennis podcast with me, James Gray, George Bellshaw and Calvin Betton. Thanks so much for joining us, as always. We love to hear from you, and we've heard from another one of you this week. So I'm going to start by reading out an email from Danny Everett, who got in touch a couple of weeks ago, but I forgot to read his email out. Danny says, I'm a new listener from Atlanta, Georgia. Lovely part of the world. One of my best friends lives in Atlanta, Georgia. I wanted to take a second and write to you after listening to your podcast last week. It was the first episode I've listened to, and I really enjoyed it. My wife, Shannon, and I listened to it while driving back to Atlanta from finals weekend at the Charleston Open, where sadly we were rooting for Badosa or Jabeur. I love the easy rapport the two of you had. Hope George feels better soon. Oh, so he enjoyed an episode without George, which is great news.
Yeah, controversial.
And your insightful commentary. Tennis is one of the few things my wife and I have a common passion for, so it's nice to be able to listen to a podcast together. We also enjoy, and then I've redacted the name of another two tennis podcasts. You Brits have a real monopoly on the market, it seems. Thanks very much for getting in touch, Danny. He's also written a bit about Carlos Alcaraz, which I think we'll come on to a little bit later on. But if you do want to get in touch, you can always email us, lovetennispod@gmail.com. You can also leave us a 5-star review. Anything you put in a 5-star review, I will read out. That's my guarantee to you. So please do that. It helps us reach more people. It helps us spend more time on the pod, and it makes us all feel better. Right, on with the tennis today. We've got loads to talk about. We are, of course, going to cover Russia and Belarus, I should say, being banned from Wimbledon, and in fact, all the British events over the summer on grass. There's also some threats that might happen in other places now as well. We'll talk about some tennis. Carlos Alcaraz winning a title in Barcelona. Iga Swiatek doing so out in Stuttgart as well. Emma Raducanu playing on clay. Anastasia Potapova also winning a title, as did Andrei Rublev. Good week for the Russians on the court, if not off it. Novak Djokovic got to the final in Belgrade as well. We'll also talk about the drop shot in Calvin's Minute Tennis. Andy Murray coming back to clay. Serena Williams buying Chelsea. Carlos Alcaraz into the top 10. WTA out of China. Somehow it's going to take us an hour. There really is only one place to start, though, and that is Wimbledon. We are, by my maths, 2 months away from Wimbledon. I'm heading down there tomorrow for the first time this year, I think, for the spring press conference, where I assume the only thing anyone will be talking about is the All England Club's decision to ban Russian and Belarusian players from Wimbledon this summer. It is, of course, a reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's something that other sports have done with team players. It's something that the ATP and WTA have not chosen to do. It's caused quite a significant stink, which I believe is basically being discussed in the corridors of power in the ATP and the WTA over the next couple of days. So it may be that what we say today is kind of overtaken by that. I'll just share with you a little bit of what Ian Hewitt, the chairman of the All England Club, said. He said, "We recognise that this is hard on the individuals affected, and it is with sadness that they will suffer for the actions of the leaders of the Russian regime. We have very carefully considered the alternative measures that might be taken, but given the high-profile environment of the championships, the importance of not allowing sport to be used to promote the Russian regime, and our broader concerns for public and player, including family safety, we do not believe it is viable to proceed on any other basis at the championships. If circumstances change materially between now and June, we will consider and respond accordingly." George, right decision or wrong decision?
Well, as someone who never sits on the fence, you'll be shocked to hear. No, I am genuinely really quite torn. It's one of those things where I'm like, I can really see both sides of the argument on this. I can understand from Wimbledon's perspective, it would be pretty awkward to have Daniil Medvedev going and winning the title, or Sabalenka or whatever. Those are kind of realistic possibilities. There's probably other points, how much of some of these players benefited from, Russian government money, etc. as well. They use it as quite I suppose, like a power growing thing, really. It's almost like some form of sports washing, these regimes use. So I can get why you wouldn't want to influence it. I do also feel it's it is kind of unfair on these players who probably have very little to do with it. They're kind of stuck in between a rock and a hard place in the sense that it's all very well us sitting here saying, oh, these guys should be condemning Putin and whatever, but we don't have our family there. God knows what could happen to them. So I have sympathy for both sides. I suspect, if there's many things that could go on. I suspect they won't be the only tournaments to do it in the end. I'm pretty sure. Well, it sounds like the Italian Open is strongly considering it in 2 weeks, and maybe the French Open as well. So I don't think it will be just them. It's classic Wimbledon moving very early and kind of unilaterally, and I was slightly surprised from that perspective. The LTA came along for the ride, but I'm sure we can go into that in a little bit later.
Calvin, I know you feel quite strongly that this is the wrong decision. Why?
It's entirely based on the fact that tennis players are independent contractors. They don't represent their country in anything other than the ATP Cup or in Davis Cup or in Billie Jean King Cup. It doesn't work like in other sports or even in such as football where they're representing a city that may be in the country. They're purely representing themselves. And I don't agree with it on that basis that most players don't have any real connection to their country. It's just something that's happening. The players who I coach don't really have any affinity to Great Britain when they play tennis. It's not like they're representing Britain if we're off somewhere in the world. They're representing themselves purely. So for that basis, I don't think they should be doing what they're doing. We're also now, if some of the rumors are correct, we're opening up a whole can of worms on ranking points that I don't see any way that they can get round.
What you're alluding to there, Calvin, is the ATP and WTA threatening to effectively desanction Wimbledon and remove the ranking points from the event. Of course, Grand Slams are a huge bastion of your ranking, realistically. We know all about that from Cam Norrie's perspective, for example, and how hard it is to drag your way up the rankings if you don't do well at the Grand Slams. Just to put it into context, a winner of a Grand Slam gets 2,000 points, but more than that, if you win the first round of a Grand Slam tournament, you get 45. You win the second round, you go up to 90. And then 180 and doubles all the way pretty much to then into the final. And that, of course, I mean, you were mentioning earlier, Calvin, an example of a player who, I think is Alistair Gray, who part of his ranking is built on performance at Wimbledon.
Yeah, he won. I don't remember whether they won 1 round or 2 rounds at Wimbledon, but just a huge amount of points. I think it's more than 50% of his doubles points. He's had a really great year in singles as well, but about 50% of his doubles points are from Wimbledon last year. If Wimbledon doesn't have ranking points, his ranking plummets on that basis.
Would then, someone like him, would they then say, well, I'm not going to play Wimbledon?
No, because the money's good.
Yeah.
That's the only reason, but it's the other tournaments around there. I don't see how they'd have a base. I do see how they'd have a basis. You could say that ranking points from the other tournaments count, like the other grass tournaments can count because you can go and play elsewhere in those weeks. Whereas Wimbledon, it's the only thing that happens that week. But then again, players shouldn't have to make decisions based on this. And this is not really just affecting Russian or Belarusian players at all. It's affecting everybody. So if they say that no British tournament can have ranking points, if we're stopping Russian and Belarusian players from entering, has huge consequences on British players.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think the interesting thing for me now is, will they get strength in numbers? Will other events kind of follow suit? I think it's a much harder position for the WTA to suddenly like, okay, well, the ATP, it's one thing to say we're going to scrap Wimbledon ranking points, but can you do that for 2 of your Grand Slams, for all the clay court tournaments before that, if the US Open decide the same as well? So I think there'll be kind of more power coming through. But yeah, I was really surprised the LTA are kind of on board with this, like, to a degree, because it's like Wimbledon has so much power, has so much clout, that they can, and we've seen Grand Slams just actually unilaterally so often. But this is quite a ballsy move from the LTA, I'd say. Like, they don't really have the allure. There are other tournaments going on in the build-up to the grass court. There's genuinely more risk for a lot of those tournaments, I think, than Wimbledon, given its kind of prestige, if you like.
But let's also not forget that the LTA gets 40-50 million quid a year from the All England Club. And as I always say to you, George, it staggers me, that is done as basically a favour. Like, there is no, as far as I've ever been able to find out from anyone who knows, there is no contractual obligation for the All England Club to give this profit to the LTA. So while I admit that there's no way Wimbledon would ever say, well, we're just going to hang on to this cash if you don't toe the line with us, it does create a power dynamic whereby when the All England Club say one thing, the LTA are very unlikely to not say another. And I would also suggest that before any of this came out, there's no way that they wouldn't have consulted with each other. We know that they didn't. And therefore, if they both agree on it, it's more likely to happen, if that makes sense.
But the LTA are also, big partners of the ATP and the WTA Tour and really rely on them as well. They can take those events away from the LTA pretty easily, like compared to Wimbledon. Like, moving one of the Grand Slams is infinitely tougher, in my opinion, compared to like taking out some 90Ks in Ilkley or whatever. And it's really important for the structure of the British game that those events do function in many ways. It is a lot of kind of playing opportunities. We've spoken a lot about how like Italian tennis is really building itself well on kind of challenger events, and we could do with a lot more of those. But even those other kind of grass courts events are really massive parts of like development here. There is no contractual thing with Wimbledon, but it'd be a serious PR own goal if they were to stop like funding the British game over like a political decision. But yeah, I mean, it's not an easy one. I said at the start, like, I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong answer here. I think it's a really, really tough decision, and I can completely see everyone's side on it. I think at the end of the day, though, is the decision as big in the kind of grander scheme of things, I suppose. Like, when I'm thinking about the unfairness on the players, is it, is that really a serious concern during this kind of time of international crisis? I don't know. I mean, it's hard, I suppose. This is a tennis podcast rather than a political podcast, so I don't want to claim to have any great nuance there.
It's not as straightforward as saying that Wimbledon sort of do it as a favour. They give them the money. The tournament is actually run. It has to be run through the governing body. So the Grand Slam nations are France, Australia, America, and the UK. So the LTA, it's an agreement that works for both parties, because the LTA run it at Wimbledon and allow them to make a huge amount of money. There's always talk that should the LTA want to, they can just set up a new club and decide that the British Open is not run at Wimbledon, and they can take all the money. So it's not like Wimbledon are just doing them a favour on that front. It benefits both parties. The other thing I was going to say is, I still don't know when and how this ends. For example, the one thing that it looks like now is that this war, or this conflict, it's a war, let's have it right, an invasion, it's probably not going to end anytime soon. And by their nature as well, as much as people might think, do wars really end? Like, what happens if 2 years from now, say, Putin and they come to an agreement that he takes half of Ukraine? Are we then just letting Belarusian and Russian players back in? He's invaded a country and taken half. Or it's not like we suddenly agree. Rarely in wars is a treaty signed and that's the end of the conflict. So I don't know when. It's more than likely that this is still going on 18 months, 3 years from now.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very high likelihood, or at least there is a likelihood, that basically Putin ends up occupying areas of eastern Ukraine, like the Donbass region, just as he did with Crimea or somewhere like that. So, yeah, I think that's a good point. But I would also say that, sport has a responsibility to take a role in these things. And it's not dissimilar to what we have with apartheid and excluding South African players of all sports from, sport around the world. And people disagreed on that. And, the rebel cricket tours that went to South Africa nevertheless during apartheid. I agree. I think it's very difficult. And I think you probably are wiping out a few of these players' careers for 3 or 4 years. But equally, there's nothing to stop them. I suppose there are some things stopping them defecting, but it would be, it would be an option, and lots of people did it, and lots of people who have come from countries where sanctions have been put upon them and said, right, well, I give up my passport then. I'll represent France or Portugal or Algeria or wherever it happens to be.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. I think that's definitely something that could kind of happen down the line. I mean, but you're right, Captain. I mean, the issue is longevity. When do you start? When do you stop any of this sort of stuff? It's who else is going to do it. You know, there's a few, which is why I think this week will be quite significant in terms of how many people get on board, because you are, if everyone does agree that they should do this and start going forward and kind of ban them from around, you know, it's all very well, we'll say people like Medvedev could be denied the chance of winning Wimbledon or whatever, but for other players who are actually trying to get into a career, wiping out 2 or 3 years of a career, that's it. It's done. That's just not going to happen. At like the professional game, someone like Medvedev can probably come back, no problem, in 2 years and still be pretty brilliant. But for those other guys who are trying to make their way up, it's going to be, really quite hard. So yeah, it's a really tough decision all round. And as you say, hard to know where we're drawing the lines anywhere. When does this start? When does this stop? How does it end?
Although I would say I don't find those types of arguments particularly convincing, because drawing lines and deciding how much things matter and how much things don't matter and when they start and when they stop, that is what you do every day. Like every day you leave the house and you go, oh, well, it's raining, but it's only raining a bit, so I won't wear a coat. Or you go, oh, well, actually, I could get run over if I cross this road, but actually the chances are I won't. Like, those decisions, and if you lived in a different country, the roads would be more dangerous and you'd think about crossing the road more. But those decisions are something we do every day. And as sporting bodies, you have to make these judgment calls all the time, and you have to decide where and when you make those decisions. I think it's very brave and bold of Wimbledon to stand up and say, we've decided that there's a line. Because, to be honest, when it comes to COVID and vaccination, they didn't take that approach. They said, we're just going to do what the government says. We're just going to, whatever the government guidelines are, we're just going to stick by them. They didn't take a stance on that because, incredibly, they thought that was too politically dangerous, whereas taking a stance on war they found easier. But, I mean, that's just where we are in the current kind of consensus.
Yeah, and again, Wimbledon is very closely linked to the government, so they certainly wouldn't be doing anything without very strong backing within those powers of corridor. You know, they've always got the upper hand, Wimbledon, with a lot of their kind of lucid connections, if you like.
What's a lucid connection when it's at home, George? Is that a civil service term? Now that you live in the corridors of power, you've actually learnt the lingo.
There's no power anywhere to do with me.
George has got this new tattoo that you won't be able to see of just one eye in a pyramid on the back of his hand. I've no idea what it means. But...
Have you got one of those notes from Jacob Rees-Mogg, George?
I've not. Different department, unfortunately. Okay. Unfortunately, no comment.
What I think will be quite interesting going forward, to kind of throw this forward a little bit, will be, as you mentioned, George, and alluded to, when this first broke 4 or 5 days ago, it felt that Wimbledon were very much out of step with everyone, and that actually, most other tournaments would not take these steps. Certainly the ATP and the WTA said they felt it was an entirely unfair thing to do. But now we hear that the Italian government are thinking of intervening and stopping Russian and Belarusian players playing in Rome. We don't think anything's going to happen in Madrid. I mean, that is now so close. I think qualifying starts in 3 days for the WTA event, so that would probably be inactionable. But we also hear that now the French presidential elections are over, that they may consider taking action because it's a little bit less of a political hot potato. I'm sure that Marine Le Pen will take that. Who knows how she'll take it. But having watched a lot of videos of how her supporters took the election result, I think it might get quite punchy. And actually, I don't want to make jokes about that. But more to the point, how will the rest of the world respond to this, Calvin?
I think for tennis, and I think this is what a lot of people don't get, because when there's a slam on, there's only one tournament on that week. When there's a 250 a 1000, it's basically there's only that tournament on. Whereas further down, you've got usually about 5 or 6 challengers on in any 1 week. You've got about 14 futures tournaments, and that's just in men's. And the same thing would happen in women's. And the whole premise of the tennis tour works that players can choose to play whichever tournaments they want. Now, if certain countries are banning certain players from entering, but they're commanding the same ranking points, the tour kind of collapses then. It doesn't make any sense, because then you'd go, why wouldn't you go to a tournament? Russian players tend to be quite good. So why wouldn't you go and play tournaments in places where the Russians are not allowed to enter, as opposed to places where they are allowed to enter? I don't see how long this is sustainable for. And still have. And I get that it's not the main problem here. But I'm speaking. It is a tennis podcast. I'm talking purely about the tennis side of it. The rankings will become a mess if you do this. That's what my concern is.
The other kind of elephant in the room, I think, from a Tennessee perspective, is the role in the ATP and WTA in all of this. Like, their job is to represent both tournaments and the players. And in situations of conflict like this, I don't see how you can actually feasibly do that. They've obviously landed on the player side at the minute. But if that momentum builds up and, say, every kind of big tennis nation decides to start banning on those sides, I think it really exposes like quite a fundamental flaw. And, for all we've kind of poked fun at Djokovic's PTPA sometimes and whether they're the right people to lose it, they've always had a fair point about the actual governance. Like, there are great conflicts of interest, and it's hard to resolve those. And this is really going to shine a light on that, I think.
You mentioned the PTPA, George, which for people who don't know is the players' union set up in part by Novak Djokovic and a great deal of other players, but of course, being the world number one, he's the most significant one. They did release a statement 3 days ago saying, "We strongly denounce the Russian and Belarusian invasion of Ukraine. We recognise that we cannot stop violence, but our collective voice can be used to support Ukraine and its citizens who continue to advocate for peace and justice. The PTPA is committed to learning from and protecting our tennis, both privately and publicly. We've listened to many individuals who are deeply impacted by this war and thank them for sharing their stories. As a major competition throughout our sport contemplates banning Russian and Belarusian athletes, we have to reflect and understand that many of them have lost the freedom of choice and expression due to the laws in Russia and Belarus. The PTPA does not discriminate against any tennis player based on nationality, but will stand against those who support, express, or commit violence against the innocent." Now, for 15 points, can anyone tell me what the PTPA's point of view is? Because I don't think they have one.
Yeah, their point of view seems quite similar to mine, that there's lots of arguments on both sides, but they really should be defending. But I guess it's the problem because, there are Ukrainian players out there who strongly agree with this decision, and other players will strongly agree. Like, it's hard to have a stance on this. It's like,
so this is the problem, right? Like, if this were a trade union, you would poll the members on it. You'd hold some sort of ballot, and then you would say, right, well, this is the democratic decision that the union has decided they stand for. And you would say, we will, of course, support individual players in individual cases, whether they be Ukrainian or Russian, and give them the support that they individually need. But this is the view of the players' union. That's how a union works. That is how collective action works.
And I think it was Ben Rothenberger called this like a massive missed opportunity because, this was a really good chance for them to like show why a union is needed for certain issues and why it doesn't make sense to happen within the WTA and ATP. And they've kind of said nothing and done nothing. So,
do we think it's likely that players could boycott Wimbledon over this? Do you think any players might actually take a stance and say, "I'm not going to play"? And if so, who?
I think this again comes back to the point about how widespread it becomes with other tournaments. I think it's more possible if it was just Wimbledon for like sanctions that Calvin kind of mentioned about like rankings points and stuff like that. But if the French get on board and the Italian Open, I don't really see that. Like, at the end of the day, as much as we like tennis, you have to be kind of inherently selfish about your own career. They'll all want to play. They'll all want to win titles. They'll all want to take the money. So I personally don't see it if it becomes as widespread as I suspect it might.
I see Nikola Pilic, the Croatian former player, has come out and said that he would support a boycott. He says, "There is every kind of Russia-phobia in Great Britain. It has always been like this. I don't think anything like this was done when Americans invaded Iraq and killed large numbers of civilians. Did they ban their tennis players from playing? I consider it a real exaggeration." This kind of whataboutery is kind of what I was alluding to earlier when I said you have to decide which wars are better and which wars are worse. As far as I know, no one's been convicted of committing any war crimes in the Middle East on a mass scale, certainly not government-sanctioned ones, although I know that there are people who would campaign against the Iraq war and suggest otherwise, but I'm afraid the legal system disagrees with you. But we are fairly sure, and there is repeated evidence for war crimes having been committed in Ukraine. So we've decided as a sport that that's where we draw the line. Does anyone care what Nikola Pilic says?
No, I mean it's a nonsense anyway, because at the time the Iraq stuff is sort of in hindsight. We know it was a bit of a mess, but at the time there was a leader who was threatening to attack other countries. Yeah. So that's why it happened. But it's not even the same thing. You could make the same argument, although there aren't many. You could make the same argument, why aren't Saudi Arabian players banned? But there aren't any, so that's probably why.
Well, I think this is actually, and this kind of brings me on to the point that I've made to a lot of people, which is that Russia, more than any other warmongering country in the world, has aggressively used sport to wash its image, to sanitize its image. Putin uses the Olympics to start invasions. In 2008, on the day of the opening ceremony of the Olympics, he invaded Georgia. In 2014, I think a couple of weeks after the beginning of the Sochi Winter Olympics, he invaded Ukraine. And now he went to China during the Beijing Winter Olympics. He was at the opening ceremony talking to his biggest ally in the world, Xi Jinping, and consequently invaded Ukraine shortly afterwards. Make no mistake, Russia uses sport to create a smokescreen around these wars. That's why it's so important, in particular, that sport stands up against Russia. It's not a case of Russophobia. It's a case of a regime that has aggressively used sport for ill means, basically. And I'm dreadfully sorry that Daniil Medvedev is going to suffer at the hands of that, although I don't think his kids will starve. And I'm sorry that Andrei Rublev will suffer at the hands of that to an extent. Or Anastasia Pavlyuchenkova, or Lyudmila Samsonova, who frankly, hasn't had a lot to do with Russia in recent years. But that's life, unfortunately, and there are far greater sufferings going on.
What did we make of Rublev's alternative suggestion, seeing as you've...
So you'll have to fill me in on exactly what was going on here, because I was on holiday, but he said that the Wimbledon spoke to the Russian and Belarusian players, and they said they agreed to sign a contract and then donate their prize money to Ukrainian humanitarian causes. Yeah,
I think so.
I mean, I think that's a great idea. I'm a little bit disappointed that Wimbledon didn't bite on that, because I think that would have been, if you'd publicised that really hard, and if Wimbledon had, say, agreed to match them pound for pound, albeit that the prize money comes from Wimbledon anyway, but you know what I mean. I think that would have been a very strong message, but I can see that they, in the end, found it unacceptable. And, Wimbledon is about enduring images, and the idea of Daniil Medvedev standing on the balcony, holding up the trophy, having been presented it by a member of the British royal family, I can see why, from a PR perspective, that is unavoidably and kind of intolerably bad. I don't know, Calvin, would you have gone for the donating prize money line?
Yeah, I think it was fair enough. I don't know what they want the players to do. This is the thing, other than come out and categorically slate Putin and slate the war, which they can't do. It's impossible for them to do it. We know why. What would the feeling be if, say, Andrei Rublev did that, or Daniil Medvedev did that, and then it came out that his family have disappeared? How would tennis feel about the situation then? How would Wimbledon feel about it then? There's some moralising to be done then. But so I don't know what they want them to do, and how they want them to get back into playing.
Yeah. I think that is a very good question. I don't have an answer. George, do you have if you were to put yourself in those shoes?
This comes back to it, because I genuinely think there is real credence on both sides of the arguments on this entire thing, and that is a really unavoidable part of this, is that
the PTPA aren't going to give you a job, George. Right.
But there's not a good solution in this. I mean, there rarely is in war, I suppose, as a whole, not to get too philosophical, but it's
breaking news from George Bellshaw: war is bad.
glad we nailed that one. I felt like we hadn't stressed that enough. So
that might be the podcast title: war is bad.
Yeah, war is bad. I don't know. I mean, I think it's just all very messy and horrible in the first place, and it's always a shame that it comes into stuff like tennis, I suppose. But I also think it's great that tennis should make stances,
and can make a difference.
Basically, I'm saying nothing.
Yeah. George, you wanted to shine some light on an interview with Sergei Stakhovsky, who has obviously been You will all know him as the Stack Attack as a tennis player. People in Ukraine now know him as a war hero, George.
Yeah, I mean, I just thought it was a really good interview. It was Mike Nixon from the Daily Mail, obviously like really well timed with the kind of Wimbledon news at the minute as well. But he was kind of talking about the context, and I think again, if I were to lean slightly to a side, this interview was probably a bit of a piece of me moving towards more broad support of Wimbledon's decision. To be honest, like I thought it was a really just puts it into context. It's absolutely horrendous, the sort of things that Stokowski's detailing. And, you know, when I'm actually framing this conversation, I think it's really unfair for a lot of these Russian players to kind of have their career taken away from them. But you put it in the context against what guys like Stokowski and, you know, Alexander Usyk, for example, in boxing are going through. I mean, it's incomparable. So it's, yeah, I highly recommend everyone read it, really, because it's, you know, it puts a lot of things in very strong perspective. So
yeah, I will put a link on the Love Tennis Pod Twitter at Love Tennis Pod. I'll put a link on there so you can give it a read and give Mike the clicks he deserves. I know some of you will object to it because of the Daily Mail, but sport is very much a separate silo there. I know it well, and Mike is a fine journalist and a fine writer, so I urge you to go and read that. Next, we'll be talking about Emma Raducanu, Iga Swiatek, and a little bit about one man, Novak Djokovic. I was just regaling off-air the lads with, if you think you've had a bad Monday, imagine sitting down at your desk at 8 o'clock in the morning, having cycled to work like a good responsible citizen that I am, and realising that you have left your rucksack with all of your clothes and your wallet and your keys on your desk at home, and now have to sit in your sweaty cycling gear at work all day. That was my Monday morning, so I hope that makes you all feel a bit better about things. I imagine Iga Swiatek had a marginally better Monday morning than that because she cannot stop winning. It's quite remarkable, really. She won her 4th title of the year this week. In Stuttgart, she beat Aryna Sabalenka 6-2, 6-2 in the final. She's now won consecutive titles in Doha, Indian Wells, Miami and Stuttgart. It's a winning run that puts her in the kind of company... I think the kind of company we hoped and expected she would end up in. In terms of 21st century winning runs in the WTA, I think she's up to 23. Am I right in saying she's up to 23 matches now in a row, victories in a row, which puts her something like 9th on the 21st century list. I'll read you the names of people who have done longer streaks in the 21st century. Venus Williams, Serena Williams, Justine Henin, Serena Williams, Victoria Azarenka, Serena Williams, Justine Henin, Venus Williams, and then Naomi Osaka on 23 last year. George, we know how good Iga Swiatek is. We've talked about how well she's played this year. It must be quite refreshing, nevertheless, that she's gone from hard, where she was incredibly dominant, onto clay, and looks like she's not even really stopped to change her shoes.
Yeah, it is encouraging, and I think we've always said about Swiatek that her ability to play on all surfaces well will serve her very well. It's always just been about finding some consistency. And let's be honest, I mean, the consistency she's found now is pretty bloody impressive. I mean, it's not often these matches are close. I think Samsonova got a set off her, but that must be one of the only sets people have taken off her in about 3 weeks.
You're right, George. It is the only set that anyone has taken off her since Angelique Kerber on the 9th of March.
The big challenge now, of course, is can you do it in the slams? Can you do it when it really matters? I know Calvin hates my arguments about the day gap between slam matches, but that's the time when, in my humble, unprofessional opinion, that it does get to you in the women's game. That's like the kind of feeling of weight on top of it. And Swiatek has won one Grand Slam when there was no pressure on her, there was no expectation, but she's not followed that up. And it all went to pieces in the semi-finals of the Australian Open. The way she's bounced back has been amazing. I'm not, I don't want to dwell on that result too much, but she needs to power through and win it now. Barty's out the way. I think only Paula Badosa is the player I'd say could stop her in theory.
Paola Badosa, interesting. New world number 2, Paola Badosa, we should say as well. But she lost in the semi-finals in Stuttgart. She was beaten by Aryna Sabalenka, who, in fairness, has beaten Swiatek quite recently. And I would suggest, Calvin, on the basis that Yelena Ostapenko has a 3-0 record against Swiatek, Aryna Sabalenka is the type of player who could, on the right day, beat Swiatek just because she blows her away, and that's really the only way she's going to lose at the moment.
Yeah, I'd still favour Swiatek most of the time, but Swiatek, can play that way. I've not seen Sabalenka play all that much recently, so I don't know whether she's entirely got over those serving issues. Because while we're talking about playing under pressure, that's what might happen. And Sabalenka, let's be honest, has never been great under pressure in the big tournaments. That's where she doesn't play well.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think it's interesting that you see a clay court. I mean, I know that Stuttgart, George, and you can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but Stuttgart, I think, is one of the quicker clay courts. It's obviously indoors, which has a different... I mean, I don't know, Calvin, how does indoor clay differ from outdoor clay in particular?
It's more that clay differs from one court to another.
Right.
You can go from pretty medium paced clay, which you tend to get more medium pace if it's hot in the hotter countries, and if it's dry, because the water just slows it down. As you can imagine, the balls pick up more clay when the court's slightly damp. So places like northern Germany tend to have very, very slow clay.
Yeah.
Whereas I guess somewhere in the south of Italy, south of Spain, even Monte Carlo historically is pretty medium paced.
Yeah.
But and then you obviously have the issue of Madrid, that it's altitude. So indoor clay would be more. It depends on the court. I don't know what the court speed is, but then the air is thinner, obviously, because it's indoors, so the ball will fly through the air a bit more than it will outdoors.
Interesting. And yeah, so kind of backing up, having two big hitters in Swiatek and Sabalenka in the final. 6 double faults for Sabalenka in the final, Calvin, which I think over 2 sets is a pretty decent tally for Sabalenka, given like 3 months ago you'd expect that to be in double figures, quite frankly. I seem to remember her, I think, was it in Australia? She won a match. She did the encore interview, and the first thing she said was, "Only 9 double faults, yes!" Which I thought really made me laugh and was quite sweet. And given everything that's going on off the court for her, obviously being Belarusian and with what we talked about, pretty impressive. Iga Swiatek's run also gives us a chance to see Emma Raducanu on clay for one of the very first times in her career, given that she only played her first clay court pro match in the Billie Jean King Cup a couple of weeks ago. She beat Storm Sanders 6-1, 6-2. She then played lucky loser Tamara Korpach, who I have to admit I've not seen play before, but she beat her 6-love, 2-6, 6-1, and then came up against Swiatek. George, 6-4, 6-4 defeat. I don't know about you, but 8 games is certainly on the upper end of my estimate of how many I thought Raducanu would get.
Definitely. I think that was a pretty... It never sounds like a decent result in normal times to lose in straight sets, but I think you'd absolutely take a 4-4 against Swiatek on current form. I thought Raducanu had a really good week, to be fair. I think we were a bit kind of criticising her a little bit last week in terms of, she obviously had that first top 50 win and then had the blisters problem, and there's lots of questions over her durability, etc. I think she's bounced back really well, considering there were talk about her maybe pulling out of Stuttgart. So I kind of wonder if this week might be a bit of a turning point, to be honest. It feels to me like, I think we're a bit worried, given her lack of experience on clay, like whether she'd be able to pick up as many points as we were thinking, given how bad the start of the year's been. But actually, I think there might be a bit of an uptick if she gets the odd decent draw here. So, yeah, I think probably the most encouraging week, well, comfortably the most encouraging week she's had since the US Open, I would say.
A few stats to pull out for you. It was the first time Emma Raducanu's won back-to-back matches since Cluj in October last year in Romania, when she beat Herzog and Bogdan. Her meeting with Swiatek was staggeringly her first ever match against a top 10 player, bearing in mind that she is almost a top 10 player herself at this point, having moved up to number 11 in the rankings this morning, and she will probably go higher than that, given that she still won't have any points to defend until she gets to Wimbledon. So we imagine she will pick up a top 10 ranking for the first time in her career. She beat Storm Sanders 6-1, 6-2 in an hour and 10 minutes, which is impressive. Storm Sanders had some decent results, albeit she's still only just inside the top 200. Calvin, I don't know how much you saw of Radicanu over the week, but we talk about clay court as a tactically challenging conditions, and I think we think that is maybe what Radicanu lacks at the moment, is that tennis IQ.
I don't know if I'd say that, because before she won the US Open, everything about her was that she was such a smart player.
Right.
I wouldn't say she lacks tennis IQ. There's other things that I think she lacks. I'm not sure that I'm reading a whole lot into the last week, just based on the people who she beat. Mm-hmm. It was a lucky loser. And who did she beat in the first round again?
Storm Sanders, the world number 197.
Yeah, I don't really know what there is to read into those two things. I'm sure that some of the Radicanu, I believe the youth call them stands, would take huge positives from it. I'm not sure I would. I think she'd have beaten those players at any stage since the US Open. It's not that type of player she struggled with. So it's not criticism of Radicanu. She beat the player she was expected to beat. She lost to the player who she wasn't expected to beat.
Do you take any positive in a tight match with Swiatek at the minute compared to something in the context of how many bagels and breadsticks she's been handed out for fun the last few weeks, or is that setting the bar too low for the mighty?
Setting the bar too low. Look, I'm not getting into like, oh, she got 4 and 4. It's like one that tennis parents always come to me with. Oh, but a lot of games went to juice. Right, brilliant. Yeah,
I say that all the time, Calvin.
It's always the players who've lost 6-1, 6-love. But a lot of games went to juice. So pretty much a win then, shall we call it that? No, look, it's 4 and 4. It's like, is that close? Is that what we call a close match? Was she ever in front in the match?
I think in the backdrop of how unclose Swiatek's matches have been over the last few weeks, it feels closer.
I'll try and quantify it, if I can. Partly the match lasted 1 hour 45 minutes, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that is the second longest match that Swiatek has had to play since the second round in Indian Wells, i.e. when she started this run of straight sets victories. So, okay, the rallies were longer. I appreciate this is the realms of tennis parents and every game going to juice, but she did seem to rally with her more effectively. If you look at the dominance ratio, which is a stat that Jeff Sackman's tennisabstract.com website generates, it was 1.41, which is quite a high number, but compared to all of her previous matches, again, only 1 or 2 of the previous 23 wins, or 21 wins I should say, had a dominance factor of lower than that. So it would suggest that compared to lots of the other people that Swiatek has smashed this year, and there are plenty of them, Radicanu was getting a little bit closer.
It's one of those, isn't it? It's the tennis scoring system. Look, you can go down that route and say, oh, she did well, it's 4 and 4, but then, like, Swiatek beat Osaka. What was it, 4 and love or 4 and 1?
4 and love.
Yeah, 4 and love, right? If Osaka plays Radicanu, she's beating her handily. I'm not, it's not like that. I used to coach this girl whose dad was a bit of a nutter, and he used to think it was like an algorithm like this. He'd go like, oh, well, my girl beat that girl 2 and 2, and then she beat the other girl 2 and 2, so that means my girl should beat her love and love, and anything worse than a love and love is pretty much a loss,
right?
And it's like, it's different matches on different days. Like I said, the only thing I'd read into last week with Radicanu was that she beat the players who she was expected to beat, and she lost to the player who she wasn't expected to beat. And at the end of the day, it's the world number 1 beat the world number 11 4 and 4. Which is kind of about what you'd expect.
Yeah, fair enough. Can't disagree with that too much. The only other things to draw out of Stuttgart was the success, and Calvin's going to hate it when I call this success, of Lyudmila Samsonova taking a set off Iga Swiatek, which in fairness no player had done in 6 weeks. I've watched quite a lot of Lyudmila Samsonova this week, and I promptly posted in the Love Tennis podcast WhatsApp group, does anyone have any strong feelings on Lyudmila Samsonova? There was little response, because I think she's going to win the French Open. My power rankings model has her quite high as someone who might outperform their expectations. I mean, it's the first time she's won 3 matches in a row for about a year, so who knows? But she is an interesting player because she grew up in Russia, but then has spent a lot of time in Italy as well, and she trained at the Riccardo Piatti Academy, which obviously helped produce Yannick Sinner. So, and she's a big tall girl, and she hits the ball well, and she's got some very impressive wins on clay. So, just a name to watch out for, Lyudmila Samsonova. George,
that prediction has the potential to age as well as my Barty Swiatek French Open final prediction, given she might get banned from the French Open next week. So, I'm glad someone else is risking.
Might be in a similar situation. Paula Badosa's up to world number 2 as well. She, as I mentioned earlier, got to the semi-finals before losing to Sabalenka. Very sort of feels deserved, which hasn't always been the case in WTA rankings, George.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the thing I've said most about Badosa about kind of her last year has been, I think, with a year of extra experience last year, I think she wins the French Open. I think she has the tools to be a really, really excellent clay court player. And, she isn't it. She's world number 2. Of course, she's an excellent clay court player, but she's got the potential to win slams. And, that big win in Indian Wells last year, I think was her first Masters title. It's just felt like she's been one of those players, a bit kind of like Sakari, to be fair as well, who just has been slowly ticking off every extra stage. And of course, I think Swiatek's going to win the French Open right now. You'd be foolish to back against Swiatek in her form. But Badosa is playing well and is very good on clay. And there aren't too many great specialists out there, as we've kind of spoken about before. So I think it'll be a big tournament for her.
Just briefly, because I mentioned it in the intro, good week for Anastasia Potapova over in Istanbul. She actually had to come through qualifying to get into the main draw, but she then romped through the rest of it. She beat Petra Martic, Sarah Sorribes Tormo, Yulia Putintseva, and then a very good win over Veronika Kudermetova in the final. Beat her 6-3, 6-1 to claim the title. So a decent week for her, to say the least. She was ranked 122 before that. She is now ranked significantly higher, 78 in fact, so a big jump there. Calvin.
Yeah, it came about a year too late, didn't it? Because I had her as my up-and-coming player last year.
You can probably take some credit for it. You can probably say, well, she didn't have the year I expected her to have, but, I still picked a player. So you can have some credit for that.
I didn't expect to spending the whole of last year on yachts in Dubai. No, I expected her winning tennis matches. I also think it was quite a good week for 2 British girls out there, wasn't it? They made the semis. Olivia Nichols and Alicia Barnett made the semis of they've already made a final, I think, of a WTA 250 this year, and this was
in the doubles.
Yeah, in the doubles. Yeah, it was interesting actually. I think maybe cover this just now. I was speaking to a couple of the guys who are in the coaching team from the Billie Jean King Cup last year, and they were saying that they got a little bit of criticism, I think, in the media for not selecting a recognised doubles pair. And then obviously the tie came down to the doubles, and they sort of made a very, very decent point, I think, to me, that the problem is that the Billie Jean King Cup format is different to Davis Cup. So you only actually get to the doubles if the singles is 2-all, and you have a limited team of who you can select. So they were saying that basically you're taking a huge risk selecting a doubles pair, because if somebody from the singles gets injured, or say you have a couple of injuries, you've then got no one to play the singles. And apparently it's something like only 14% of ties have actually gone to the doubles.
Wow.
In the last couple of years.
Alicia Barnett and Olivia Nichols now both both up to career high rankings and both on the verge of the top 100. So I think they're currently the British number 3 and number 4. So certainly making a case for. And I often have people on Twitter say, "Oh, why don't you write about doubles more? Why don't you talk about doubles more?" We'd love to. It's just that it doesn't quite have the profile that singles does, clearly, and we haven't had, that I can think of, a really. Calvin, you'll be able to know much better than me. Elite level female British doubles players. Anyone?
Not that I can think of.
Obviously, Laura Robson won mixed doubles Wimbledon.
Yeah, we know what I think of mixed doubles. Absolute exhibition event.
George, did you have an elite? Did you have a name?
I was actually just going to come back to the kind of challenge at the point that was made against you writing doubles there, is that you've probably missed, this might be the most newsworthy last 12 months in tennis I think there's ever been. There's not been many like down periods.
Yeah. And in fairness, we do the best British doubles player is now the world number one. So, and I wrote about it. So I feel like I've done my dues to a certain extent. Let's crack on. There's still loads more to get through. I said we'd talk about Novak Djokovic, and finally we will. This might be a record. This might be the longest time we've taken to actually start talking about Novak Djokovic for about 6 months. He was in action on home clay in Belgrade this week. He only played, Serbians or Russians. He beat Laszlo Djere, Maimir Kecmanovic, Karen Khachanov, and then he was beaten in the final by Andrei Rublev. He did not win an opening set all week. He every single time basically he came from behind, and then in the final he couldn't. Andrei Rublev bageled him in the final set, which has only happened 12 times in his career before then. Georgie's talking about feeling drained, about how he's had a bit of an illness, that he's not really sure what it is, and that he feels very tired in final sets. Is Novak Djokovic, and whisper it, getting old?
I like that he says he doesn't know what the illness is when he was banging on about definitely having COVID at the start of the year. I wonder if that's a factor. Is he getting old? It's a good question. I mean, I've actually been quite impressed with the bits and pieces I've seen of him this week. I caught the end of was it his first win of the week, and he was striking the ball really, really well, and looked very fired up. To be honest, like I've kind of said this before about Djokovic, that the last year or so when he's been so good at the slams, results outside of it haven't really felt that kind of decisive for me either way for him. I think what he needs at the minute is matches to get his match fitness back up. So him being drained right now, probably you kind of expect after a tough week and first couple of weeks back on the tour for a while. So yeah, I'm not too worried about that. I think this week was a step in the right direction. Some good hard matches. He came through, found some good level tennis. I'm pretty sure he's going to peak pretty well for the French Open, and I've got him as the favourite again all of a sudden, despite Nadal's great starts of the year. I think Nadal, obviously being slightly hampered by fitness, I think that's playing into Novak's hands right now, and I'm pretty sure he'll be ready by then. So even though your rankings have Tsitsipas, as you may want to discuss
Calvin, we'll come to that, George. There's an algorithm. Calvin, I know you're a big fan of match practice and a big kind of what's the word? Oh, my words have gone. Fan, supporter, advocate. That's the word I was needing. It's been a long day. I know you're a big advocate of match practice, but is that why? Is it because when you haven't got matches under your belt and you get into a third set, your legs don't have in them what they need to, or is it about mental kind of capacity and that kind of thing?
It's everything, yeah. It's the physical side of things. You can be immensely fit and then you get into a match and you're blowing at 4-all in the first. I've seen that happen many a time. I don't think there's any reason to think that Djokovic won't be extremely competitive at the very least in 2 to 3 weeks. He'll be there, and yeah, in the French. I think one thing I would say is I think maybe it's not so much that he's come down, it's that a few more have caught are getting closer. That, as we were seeing a bit last year, Tsitsipas was pretty close to him in the final. Zverev beats him pretty regularly now. Rublev's there in the mix. There's Carlos Alcaraz who's coming in the mix. So it's not like the French Open there's a fair few people who could win it.
One of whom I think we probably wouldn't have considered a few months ago, but we have to at least talk about now, is Andrei Rublev, who won the title. He beat Djokovic 6-2, 6-7, 6-love, as I mentioned. A decent run. He beat Fabio Fognini in the semi-final, which shouldn't be sniffed at, realistically. He also beat Jiří Lehečka, I can't say his name, Lecheka, who's the Czech player who's making some serious strides, and I think is another name you should watch out for. He's only 20, and he obviously picked up some amazing wins in the Davis Cup finals last year, which is where I first noticed him. So clearly some form for Rublev. We always say, or certainly Calvin, I know you say a lot, that he's not the most skillful player in the world, but beating Djokovic on clay, even if it's a Djokovic who has had a bit of a wobble and isn't in top form, I mean, it's an impressive result to have on your card, isn't it?
Yeah, any win against Djokovic is a decent win. Is that his first time he's beat him?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, yeah. And look, I'd still expect Djokovic to give it another 2 weeks. I think he'd beat Rublev. But yeah, absolutely, it's a good win for him. As we've said for a while on Rublev, he tends to clean up the guys who he's ranked above, doesn't he? And tends to struggle against the ones who are above him. I
suppose it was a 250 final, so really we should have known that Rublev, the king of the 250s, was going to win.
True, yeah. It's I mean, we're surely got to be online for somewhere in a 250 this year. Rublev against Rude in a final, somewhere on
clay in like October.
Yeah, maybe like Gestad.
Oh yeah,
like that. I was gonna say that, the clay that comes after Wimbledon. That's definitely when that final's happening.
Yeah.
George, how would you rate Rublev's clay court chances? I assume we're going to say third tier at the French Open.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not as convinced as Calvin is, as it's as wide open as people have believed. I still think one of Nadal or Djokovic will win. I think then you're looking at my second tier would be Tsitsipas, Zverev, and probably Alcaraz in there at the minute, but still potentially not quite on that level to a degree, which is maybe a bit harsh, but I just, in terms of like consistency of delivering at slams and stuff, it's always hard to have a proper read on that. Then in the tier below, Rublev in there with people. I mean, even Team I have in that tier just based on past performances, but the reality is he's probably absolutely nowhere near.
Have you seen
anything.
Dominic Thiem hit a forehand lately? Like it's
Team's not in the mix.
Not in the mix, but I'm just saying. But of people I genuinely think can win the French Open, the list is very short. So I'd put in someone who has...
Like when you say "can," like I don't think you know what the word "can" means.
What do you think? Wait a minute.
I think there's a certain level you have to come through to win a slam.
You think Team has more a chance of winning a slam, winning the French, than Andrei Rublev?
No, I said I'd put them in the same tier.
You think he has the same chance as Andrei Rublev?
I think he's in that same ballpark. I don't think either of them have a chance.
When was the last time that Dominic Thiem won a match? When did he last win a tennis
I'm just saying. Look, I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you. But it's about a ceiling, isn't it? And what he could get up to. I don't think he will now. Probably. But he's still in that tier for me. Casper Ruud's also in that tier. None of them are going to win the tournament. Wawrinka's probably still in that tier. I'll
tell you something I was thinking, going slightly off topic earlier, when I saw this debate about, I saw somebody wrote some nonsense about how Alcaraz is he's going to be better than Nadal. Because they said he moves better than Nadal did at the same age. He hits bigger than Nadal did at the same age and all this kind of thing. And it got me thinking about the kind of, I guess, the graph of where tennis players go. And this is kind of like towards the end of Nadal's career now. And I wonder, is the current version of Nadal better than the 19-year-old version of Nadal? Like, who'd win that match?
Interesting. Nadal now, I think.
And do they, but maybe it's that. Maybe it's a sort of, I don't know how you'd term it. Maybe they're at the same place. Of the Nadal, he was at 19, he was on the way up, and now he's on the way down, and maybe we're at the same place. Obviously, the 23-year-old version of Nadal was better than the current version of Nadal.
I don't know. I mean, yes, but caveat: I think the current Nadal is an absolute fiend. Like, I think he's a whole different animal. But yeah, I see what you mean. This kind of leads me on to what I mentioned earlier from Danny Everett, our loyal listener who dropped us an email, lovetennispod@gmail.com. He said, I wanted to comment on something Calvin said about Carlos Alcaraz being the most developed 18-year-old he's ever seen. No offence to Carlos, or Calvin for that matter. I thought that statement was pretty funny, not only because I work at a university and see guys who are bigger than Carlos frequently, but because I think the claim that he's bigger than Rafa at the same age is a bit dubious. But also, it instantly brought to mind articles I've read and a few Twitter posts about NFL players in high school. He has sent us a couple of links to guys, people who are NFL fans will know these names: Derrick Henry, DK Metcalf, who ran track for the US national team and is also an NFL player, Myles Garrett and Nick Chubb. I mean, I have to say, these guys are 18 and look completely insane. And I think who's the basketball player who was absolutely enormous? Zion Williamson.
Yeah, Zion Williamson was massive, to be fair.
I believe he was a completely absurd size. Anyway, Danny says, I want to share with you as I figured you guys might get a kick out of these photos, as I have, and to keep Calvin grounded after that nice comment he got in the 5-star review you read in the beginning of the podcast.
It's about time, isn't it? Someone's called him out.
Can I say this, though, that I think there's a conflation there that the one thing that there's two things, and this is scientifically proven. There's two things that you can't alter, in terms of no matter how much physical work you do. You can never alter a person's maximum height, and you can never alter a person's maximum speed. So obviously, I'm not saying that Carlos Alcaraz is taller than Zion Williamson, but we have to do it in relative to that. And I think relative to that, then Alcaraz is as developed as Zion Williamson was at 18. And Zion Williamson, I watched quite a bit of basketball, but also I'll say about Zion Williamson, his body is knackered. He can't play anymore. He's barely been able to play in the NBA. Whereas Carlos Alcaraz will still be playing professional tennis 30 weeks of the year in 10 years' time. And
that's interesting because, of course, that was what people said about Rafa when he was the same age, right? They said, well, there's no way he can possibly sustain this level, and they looked at him and said he's the wrong shape and the wrong size, which may or may not turn out to be the case.
Well, one of the reasons why they said that was Nadal had tendinitis in his knees very young, and again, a bit of an anomaly here is that tendinitis is a wear and tear injury, and there's no way of curing it other than rest. There's no surgery or anything that you can do, and so it is remarkable that he's managed to have the career he's had with tendinitis for about 15 years.
Well, we hope that Carlos Alcaraz doesn't have tendinitis because, as I say, I watched a lot of tennis over the last week. His match against Stefanos Tsitsipas on Friday night in Barcelona was maybe my match of the year. It was not just for the tennis on show, but also for the crowd being so into it. Alcaraz has so much charisma. He loves getting in with the crowd. He's got the big fist pump going on. He makes it a real mano a mano battle, and it was, and he won 6-4, 5-7, 6-2. And yeah, it was just sensational to watch.
We're talking about quite often in the women's game, the lack of rivalries developing between the best players. That feels to me already like it's a really a match that could get people permanently excited about for the next 15 years.
The problem is that Alcaraz
is winning, but yeah, I know. But they're great matches. I mean, I think Tsitsipas, he used to have a really bad record against Felix, for example. He did eventually kind of get around it. And it's a great mix of styles. I think it's a really interesting matchup. That even though I agree with you that I think Alcaraz will probably dominate the rivalry, but I think it could be a bit of a heavyweight boxing event when those two get together in the future.
I wonder whether Tsitsipas might end up having a sort of Murray of a career, where he just gets to a lot of... I mean, Murray has won 3 Grand Slams, but in another era would have won 8. And I wonder if Tsitsipas might end up with the same thing. I don't see much of a curve with him, as in a development curve. I feel there's a plateauing, and
You wonder. You look at Tsitsipas. I look at Tsitsipas and wonder where he gets better than he is now.
Yes, that's exactly.
Is this the level? Is this his maximum level? Now, there's a chance that the players who are beating him, Nadal, Djokovic, just drop out, and his level that he's at now might be enough to win slams. But I probably don't think he gets any better than he is now.
And to be fair, I do. That is kind of how I see the game at the minute. I think Tsitsipas' level is very, very good, and it was fantastic at the French Open last year. I mean, we'd be doing him a disservice to say that wasn't slam winning level. The problem is there's
I wrote a match report of him winning his first slam. Yeah, it's it's on the cutting room floor. It's done.
Yeah, he's but these are complete freaks of nature. These guys are trying to come through even at 36 or whatever they are now.
Should have a brief word for Alex de Minaur, who had match points against Alcaraz in the semi-final on Sunday morning. The weather meant that all the semis were pushed to Sunday. De Minaur played absolutely out of his skin as well. I mean, he's a great guy to watch at the best of times. And it neatly brings me on to Minute Tennis for the day. Alex de Minaur is one of the best movers, or at least one of the fastest players on tour. As actually, Calvin, you saw up close last year at Wimbledon when he played that incredible, round the net shot. Doesn't even really cover it. Against Luke
diving round the net shot
against Luke and Anton in the doubles, which if you haven't seen, I'm sure you'll be able to find on the old Interhighway. He hates getting drop shotted, de Minaur. Boy, did he get drop shotted by Carlos Alcaraz, because he really is something of a master of one of tennis's favourite or least favourite, depending on your point of view. George, would you do the honours with some sort of clock? Yeah, I knew you weren't ready for that. You should see, honestly, the face he makes. He's a classic civil servant. He's prepared for nothing. Very good. So Calvin,
also very adaptable.
Also very not at your desk. Calvin, you've got 1 minute to tell us how best to play the drop shot, how best to use it, and how it's much more important these days than it ever was.
The drop shot is one of those shots that whenever you see it played on TV or anywhere and it's successful, everyone says what a great decision it was. And whenever it's not successful, it was a terrible decision. And it's criticized for that. Basically, the way you want to, most drop shots don't succeed because they hit the net. So first of all, you have to clear the net, and most people try and get them too close to the net. The thing what a lot of people don't realize is that the next reason why they're not successful is they don't have enough height on them. So if you think about the trajectory of it in almost like a mini lob, so the ball has to go up and it has to come down and then not bounce forwards. So if you push the ball over the net, it's then bouncing towards your opponent, which is going to help them get to it. So what you want the ball to do is you want it to come down directly and then bounce almost straight up in the air. In terms of development of the drop shot, the one that we've seen recently is the side spin drop shot, which I think I'm going to talk about when one of you asks me a question.
Calvin has very cleverly worked out how to get around the fact that he's only allowed a minute to talk about it by realising that we always have more questions, and I know listeners at home always have more questions. Tell us about the side spin drop shot, Calvin.
So the side spin drop shot is something that has really come about in the last couple of years, and it's mainly played off the backhand side, but it's basically just one where you're going to the players cut across the side of the ball and the back of it, so it hits the ground and bounces sideways. So what I was talking about there was when the ball pushes on towards the opponent, so that it allows them more chance to get to it. The side spin one, it's usually played down the line off the backhand side because you can't really get inside the forehand and generate as much spin. And it basically hits the court and moves directly to the side.
Is it fair to describe current times as the most drop-shotting era in history? What's the trajectory?
Probably not in history. It was played a lot, I guess, in the 70s when players serve and volleyed, that kind of thing. It's always been played quite a lot on clay. It's probably been played more now than at any stage it has been in the last 25 years, I'd say. Just as we're getting more skillful players and they need to find different ways of playing it. It also gets played more on clay courts because, one, you need to find different ways of trying to win points because, as we discussed last week, you can't hit through players as easily. And two, because of when you think about setting off to chase a drop shot, the surface is obviously unstable. So your first step, you're not really moving anywhere. So the wrong footing drop shot is one that you'll see a lot on clay. So imagine a cross-court forehand that breaks across the sideline. The ball comes back to your forehand. The opponent will then be recovering back to the center. So if you can play a drop shot almost back behind, they're going to struggle to get that because of the unstableness of the surface. They'll wrong foot themselves and probably slide too far to the other way.
There we go. I have two sort of linked questions based on what you just said then. So when you said like the serve and volley era was like a big time for drop shots, obviously I wasn't really around there so much. I kind of assumed it would be less because, they're at the net already. I
didn't mean it in terms of serve and volley like that. I meant it's more the rackets that they played with. They didn't have the power, so they had to think of different ways of winning points. Right. So just more field shots in general back then.
Okay. And it kind of leads me into my next question. Who's had the best drop shot in history?
The best drop shot in history, Fabrice Santoro had a phenomenal drop shot. He used to hit a two-handed slice forehand. He had a phenomenal, and it was basically if anyone.
Yeah, I can't even comprehend that.
Yeah. So he would probably be up there. I'd say Santoro probably. I would think.
And worst?
Andy Murray on a bad day.
No, worse.
Djokovic has had some bad ones.
Yeah,
Probably true. Alex Zverev.
Only because it involves touch,
Yeah.
which we know he has none of.
Probably me, actually, Calvin Betton.
Right, chaps, we're running out of time. We're going to do some quick hits. It's one-word answers. Andy Murray has announced that he's going to play a couple of clay court tournaments. Calvin and George. Calvin, is this a good idea? One word.
Yeah, he needs matches.
Oh, he got a few words in. George?
Yes, he needs matches.
And second question, he says he's not going to play the French Open. Does anyone believe him?
Yeah, he won't play the French. He won't play the French Open.
I'm on the fence. He might play the French Open. It depends how well it goes. That's a lot of words. Sorry.
I'm with you, George. I think if he gets a sniff, I think if he thinks he might be able to win a couple of rounds, he might fancy it. Serena Williams is part of a bid to buy Chelsea Football Club, along with Lewis Hamilton and about 400 other celebrities. I don't know if necessarily we need a one-word answer, but George, will you ever go and watch Chelsea if Serena Williams owns a club? Will it make you more likely to go and watch Chelsea?
I'm totally unfussed on how involved she is or not. I just thought it was kind of vaguely interesting that she's involved in it.
Calvin, do you think it'll make a difference to anyone if Serena Williams owns Chelsea?
None whatsoever.
I don't know. I'm not going to get... I mean, it doesn't make a difference to anyone, but it's got me thinking about tennis and football stadiums and how great it was when the French had the Davis Cup final. Was it in the Marseille ground, the Stade Vélodrome, I think?
Yeah.
And I quite fancy a big tennis match. I'll tell you what, George, if the LTA want to take Wimbledon away from Wimbledon, they could just, Stamford Bridge be ideal. They don't use it in the summer. There's the Hurlingham Club just round the corner. They could use that for outside courts. I think we might have stumbled upon something here. Move the British Open. I think that is all we've got time for this week. We did want to mention something else, George, did we? You're making a face like you might have any other business.
I suppose there was a Peng Shuai story that kind of broke today, again about, or yesterday was it, when Steve Simons said they're definitely not going back to China, which I guess we sort of imagined would be the case, but good to see they're not dropping it as my close attempt to a one-word answer. And big financial decision, because they do rely heavily on Chinese money, the WTA, so it'll be interesting to see how they work around, I suppose.
Without wanting to hark back to our quite serious first half of the podcast, it's another one of those situations where you go, don't really see how this ends, because I know a lot about the Chinese Communist Party and they don't tend to do things by half measures.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't see them going back. It's kind of impossible for them to go back in the current stance, is it? Unless, So, quite interesting financially, if nothing else.
Indeed. That is all I think we've got time for. We will talk about Andy Murray at length a bit closer to the time when we know who he's playing and exactly what his status is, because I know that a lot of you are big Andy Murray fans and want to hear more about that. I promise you will hear it. But that is all we've got time for. Thank you so much for listening. Please do leave us a rating and a review. Tell your friends about the Love Tennis podcast. We don't have any. Please use yours.
Sports Social Podcast Network. New to the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Hi, this is Nick Hancock, and if you're enjoying this podcast, you might enjoy ours. It's called the Famous Sloping Pitch Podcast, and it's Chris, England, and myself just having fun and then not having fun talking about football. Try it.